BBC News.
That was David Austin. I'm Jackie Leonard, and you're listening to the Newsroom from the BBC World Service. And we begin in the United States, where President Obama's request to have his immigration policy reviewed has been accepted by the Supreme Court. The president's plan would allow more than 4 million undocumented migrants to remain in the country. On the line now is our Washington correspondent, Aleem Makboul. So, Aleem, what exactly led up to this? Why is the Supreme Court being asked to look at this decision?
Well, this has happened because in spite of the fact that President Obama said in late 2014 that these rules are going to be changed, and it's something that he did unilaterally, it still hasn't been implemented because various Republican states have gone to their own courts and have blocked it. And what this all relates to is to immigrants who are living in the United States illegally. There are estimated to be about 11 million. And there was a big debate about what to do in terms of immigration reform. And even some Republicans sided with President Obama and his administration in saying these immigrants do contribute. They should be asked to pay tax. If they have children who are now U.S. citizens, if they've been here long enough, if they're law-abiding, then they should be naturalized. Now, although some Republicans did agree, it got stuck in Congress, as so many other pieces of legislation have. And so this is one where President Obama said, well, enough is enough of all this squabbling. I'm going to do this by executive action. But even at the time, I remember speaking to immigrants who were here illegally saying, well, we don't want to put our names down because the Republicans could come along and see that list of names and throw us all out. And so they've been blocking it. So President Obama himself said to the Supreme Court, can you review this and push this along?
So how much of a gamble is this by President Obama? I mean, which way is it expected to go?
It's a big one. And I think in June we're going to look back at this moment as a very big one for President Obama and his legacy. This is one of the key legacy issues, as well as, improving ties with Iran and Cuba and same-sex marriage, for example, and Obamacare. Immigration reform is one of the big ones for President Obama. If the Supreme Court comes out and says, actually, you've overstepped, you are not allowed, you don't have the authority to do something as sweeping as this, then that is a big blow, not just for President Obama, but for the Democrats going into an election where immigration is going to be so important.
Aleem, thank you for that. That was Aleem Makboul in Washington. Well, the issue of migration is also proving troublesome for politicians in Europe. The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has warned that the European Union is running out of time to solve its own migrant crisis and needs to abide by the agreed plan to try to limit migrants and refugees coming into Europe, particularly via Turkey.
I share the sentiment that we have no more than 2 months to get things under control. The statistics over the Christmas period are not encouraging, with over 2,000 arrivals to the EU per day. The March European Council will be the last moment to see if our strategy works. If it doesn't, we will face grave consequences such as the collapse of Schengen. For sure, this kind of alternative to our strategy is not pleasant, and so I appeal the Member States implement the strategy in full.
Meanwhile, in Germany, 40 MPs from Angela Merkel's governing coalition have written to her demanding that she changes what they call her open door policy on the issue. How much is this challenge a consequence of the attacks on hundreds of women in Cologne on New Year's Eve, reportedly committed mainly by migrants and asylum seekers? Our Berlin correspondent Jenny Hill says the issue of how best to accommodate migrants is extremely complex.
There's no doubt, first of all, of course, that what happened in Cologne has intensified the public debate. It's certainly really inflamed it. But, that debate was already happening. And no wonder, more than 1 million people came into Germany last year seeking asylum. Already this year, now these figures aren't official, but it's been reported here, something like 50,000 people have arrived in the first 2 weeks of this year. So there is huge concern across Germany at how it's going to cope logistically. There's a lot of talk about how, for example, people here are going to make sure that that the new immigrants are taught German, for example. How on earth are you going to integrate these people? And what happened in Cologne, many see as a real symptom of that lack of integration, of a real evidence, if you like, for some that Mrs. Merkel's policy has failed and it's not really been thought through. But a lot of these critics, for example, her transport minister today has come out and said Mrs. Merkel needs to prepare to close the border. A lot of these critics, including that transport minister, are saying what we really need is a European-wide solution. But without that, we've really got to do something. Germany's going to have to act alone. And of course, Germany's not the only European country saying that. Look, for example, at Sweden and Denmark in the last couple of weeks acting by themselves, trying to tighten and, in effect, close borders. So there is a lot of concern here. It's not all aimed at Mrs. Merkel, but my goodness, she really is under a lot of pressure at the moment. At the same time, I think a lot of people here do also say, well, what else would another leader have done? These people would still have come into Europe, they argue, and we would still have had to deal with that problem.
That was Jenny Hill in Berlin. The United Nations has warned that despite the setbacks suffered by the group calling itself Islamic State in Iraq, it has still managed to inflict a staggering level of violence on civilians. A UN report found that from January 2014 to October 2015, at least 18,800 people were killed and more than 3 million displaced. Reporting from Baghdad, Jamil.
Although the UN report does not give the Iraqi security forces and related militias a clean bill of health, it focused most of its attention on the self-styled Islamic State. It said it was guilty of systematic and widespread violence and abuses against civilians, amounting to war crimes and possibly genocide. Francesco Motta, head of human rights at the UN mission in Iraq, outlined the litany of charges against IS.
Atrocities include ethnic cleansing, murder, kidnapping, rape, sexual violence, wanton destruction of religious and cultural property, destruction of essential infrastructure, and the sexual enslavement of thousands of members of minority communities.
The report added that IS had publicly executed people in horrific ways, including beheading, stoning, burning, and throwing victims off high buildings. Ravina Shamdasani of the UN's Human Rights Office in Geneva said the report is particularly relevant for people in Europe.
It lays bare why we have so many Iraqi refugees attempting to enter Europe. These are the horrors that they are fleeing at, and it's very important for the international community to understand this fully.
With Iraqi security forces unable or unwilling to prevent Shia militias or Kurdish forces carrying out reprisals against people accused of sympathizing with the IS militants, it's hardly surprising that many Iraqis have voted with their feet, seeking safe havens abroad.
Calls for a boycott of next month's Oscars are continuing because of a significant disquiet that this year's Academy Awards nominees show too little racial diversity. The director Spike Lee and actress Jada Pinkett Smith have both said they won't be attending this year's ceremony. More from our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd.
It's non-violent protest. We let people know that it's okay to say what you want to say.
The film Straight Outta Compton is about the late 80s hip-hop act NWA. Audiences liked it, and at next month's Oscars, it's up for Best Original Screenplay. But no one in the black cast is nominated for an Academy Award. Last year, all the nominees in performance categories were white. Some had hoped this year's announcements might reveal greater diversity.
For performance by an actor in a leading role, the nominees are Bryan Cranston in Trumbo, Matt Damon in The Martian.
But it didn't happen. Now, Cheryl Boone Isaacs, the African-American head of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the body which runs the Oscars, has said dramatic steps need to be taken to review our membership recruitment to bring about much-needed diversity. Jada Pinkett Smith, married to actor Will Smith, has already said she'll boycott this year's ceremony in protest at the shortlists.
Maybe it is time that we pull back our resources and we put them back into our communities, into our programs, and we make programs for ourselves that acknowledge us in ways that we see fit.
The Academy does not want this debate to dominate the lead-up to the Oscars in February.
That was Vincent Dowd. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Still to come on the newsroom, the former professional tennis player who says match fixing was rife in his sport.
These people, they have 50, 60 accounts where they place small money that at the end, is a huge money,
First, David has the headlines.
European politicians are under mounting pressure to resolve the migration crisis that's seen more than 1 million people enter the EU over the past year. The US Supreme Court has agreed to consider whether President Obama has the right to protect migrants from deportation after his plans were blocked by legal challenges. And German police say former extremists from the disbanded Red Army faction were behind a failed armoured car robbery last year.
The British government's unveiled its latest plan to combat radicalisation in schools. There are a number of initiatives, including a website called Educate Against Hate. The Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, outlined the sort of behaviour they want to stamp out.
It's things like obviously showing a particular interest in what's happening overseas and also wanting to shut down debate or wanting perhaps to pursue the path of segregation, which is not something that we want to see in this country.
So how likely then is this latest move to work? I've been hearing the story of Adam Dean of the Quilliam Foundation from London.
In my late teens, I developed a keen interest in my faith, which is Islam. I wanted to learn more about it. On this journey, I felt I wasn't getting the answers that I wanted from the elders within the community and from my local mosque. So I looked elsewhere. I bumped into someone who was part of an extremist organisation. He intrigued me and he spoke about Islam in a sort of intellectualised form. And that had an appeal. From that moment onwards, I had frequent meetings. And then what happened subsequently is I became more and more sympathetic to their ideas and then eventually joined the organisation.
And what was it that eventually changed your mind?
I became disillusioned, and I think it was a process of understanding that there's a lot more to the world than what this group was telling me. I had a mentor who was sort of a philosophy lecturer, and he kind of took me under his wing and sort of pulled me aside and said, look, there's more to this than what you're being taught. He taught me sort of critical thinking skills, and it allowed me to assess what I'd been taught. And that actually what it turned out to be was completely baseless. So I think what was the most important factor was the ability to decipher what was correct, what was dogmatic, what was incorrect for myself. And almost by osmosis, I broke away from the organisation.
Now, you came to that realisation on your own and with the help of your teacher. But what do you think of the various ways in which the British government is trying to help counter radicalisation among the young?
I think it's actually a good move. Had there been what I call kind of extremist radicalisation inoculation, perhaps I would never have joined the organisation, which is now a banned organisation known as Al-Muhajirun.
What do you think are the key points that would have helped you in the first place when you were a teenager?
When I was growing up, I didn't really have anyone that I could have respected that actually spoke the same language as myself in a way that I could relate to. Had I had ideas that stopped me becoming extreme and also someone that I respected that could explain my faith to me in a tolerant and encompassing way, I think that would have helped a lot.
Adam Dean of the Quilliam Foundation. There are nearly 2 million stillbirths in the world each year, more than 2/3 in sub-Saharan Africa. Most of these are in rural areas and could be prevented with simple improvements in maternal health care. That's according to the latest research published in the medical journal The Lancet. Nigerian women have the highest number of stillbirths in Africa. Women like Tieng Saraki.
The first thing I noticed was that my belly increased dramatically, but I was expecting twins. I thought it was normal. I guess if I'd actually had my records with me and the minute measurements had been taken, both myself and my doctor in Nigeria and the midwives there would have actually realized that it wasn't normal and it was a sign for alarm. I was rushed to the hospital and they did their best, but I delivered both twins. The second one got stuck and was a stillbirth. It was tough. I was fighting for one life and completely bewildered as how to mourn the other life. And then, we also have a culture where we don't talk about stillbirths. Not only are they taboo, they're seen as a bad thing. The blame is shared between the mother and that child that has gone. I did blame myself because I didn't have any other avenue to get the sort of information I needed to know as to why this had happened to me.
Tieng Saraki. As we were reporting at this time yesterday, the start of the Australian Open tennis tournament was overshadowed by a report from the BBC and BuzzFeed News accusing tennis authorities of failing to crack down on players suspected of throwing matches. Our colleagues at World Have Your Say have been speaking to a former professional tennis player, now a coach, who says match fixing was rife when he was playing. Frank, not his real name, retired from the professional circuit last year. Chloe Tilley asked him if he'd seen evidence of corruption.
Yes, many times. Well, I see first meetings, money transactions, fixing problems during the match result where somebody has to get a break and he didn't. So he need to call the trainer, make time to fix that online and see what the player has to do, either retire or if they can do another bet where they recover the money, or because when some player retire, the bet got cancelled.
You say you've seen meetings and money changing hands. Just explain the details of that.
This is cash. There's not wired bank to a bank. So there's people, there are three big groups, that controlling bettings in tennis. Each group have many, guys who go to talk to players. They have many guys inside the circuit, and also they have many accounts because you will see there's never a big bet. Here and there is a big bet, but it's by a lucky fan that bet. But these people, they have 50, 60 accounts where they place small money that at the end, it's a huge money, It's like a secret in the tour that everybody knows, but we don't talk about it. We just see it and keep walking,
And have you ever reported this to the tennis authorities?
Me?
Yes.
No, I haven't reported because they know who is exactly doing it. If they want to stop it, they stop it today.
And just to be clear, the people ruling tennis have rejected suggestions that they haven't done enough to tackle match fixing. Now, David has some of the other stories from our news desk.
The opposition presidential candidate in Haiti, Jude Celestin, has threatened to pull out of Sunday's planned runoff, accusing the electoral authorities of unfairly favouring the government candidate, Juvenal Moïse. Mr. Celestin said the process was a farce rigged in favour of Mr. Moïse. The German authorities are hunting members of the now disbanded Red Army faction militant group, who they believe carried out a failed armed robbery last year. The 2 men and 1 woman, who've been in hiding since the late 1990s, have been identified through DNA tests on an abandoned car. And Twitter says it's up and running again after a worldwide outage earlier on Tuesday. According to the social media site, the problem was related to what it called an internal code change. Its shares fell sharply as a result.
In the UK, only same-sex couples are allowed to enter into civil partnerships. Heterosexual couples who want legal recognition of their relationship have to get married. That's being challenged in court by Charles Keaton and Rebecca Steinfield from London, who say that they are victims of discrimination. Our legal affairs correspondent Clive Coleman was at the court hearing on Tuesday, and I asked him why the couple was so reluctant to take part in a wedding ceremony.
It's a really good question because in the UK, a civil partnership and a civil marriage are very similar to this extent that they bestow precisely the same rights and responsibilities on the couples concerned. The problem is that heterosexual couples can't enter into a civil partnership. Now, Charles Keaton and Rebecca Steinfield want their relationship to be recognised in law, but they don't want to get married. In 2014, they were stopped from registering their intention to form a civil partnership because they were a man and a woman. Now, Rebecca Steinfeld says that that's unfair for relationships like hers.
We don't see each other as husband and wife or becoming husband and wife as Mr. and Mrs. So a marriage wouldn't really make sense to us. We want to be celebrating our relationship within an institution that was created for equals, which is exactly what civil partnerships are. And that's why it's so appealing to us.
Are there any other countries other than the UK where a heterosexual couple can have a civil partnership, something which is different from a marriage?
There are. I mean, if you look at the Netherlands, for instance, where civil partnerships are available to heterosexual couples, the statistics are very interesting, particularly for those who think that if that was to happen here, it would be the end of the institution of marriage because everybody would decide they wanted a civil partnership and no one would get married. That absolutely hasn't happened in the Netherlands, where something like 12% of heterosexual couples choose to enter into a civil partnership, and that figure has remained pretty stable. So it is a minority, but it's a sizable minority. And again, I think that figure is sort of borne out, that thought is borne out. If you look at the UK, where in 2014 same-sex marriage became available, so gay couples had the option either to marry or to enter into a civil partnership, and something like 17% of gay couples have elected to have a civil partnership rather than to get married. So as I say, it's a minority, but it's a fairly sizable minority.
That was our legal affairs correspondent Clive Coleman. It's a familiar gripe of shoppers here in the UK that a lot of identical stuff seems to be much cheaper in the United States. But a new report by the Times newspaper found that in Britain, women are paying more for goods than men are. Here's some of what it says.
The cost of clothes, beauty products and toys for women and girls is higher than equivalent items marketed at men and boys, according to an analysis of hundreds of products. The sexist prices can be found at many of Britain's biggest retailers, including Tesco, Boots and Amazon. In one case, Tesco charges double the price for 10 disposable razors simply because they are pink.
So does that mean we can save money simply by avoiding pink products? Jemima Olhafsky is from the women's rights campaign group, the Fawcett Society.
In some cases, and I think this is an issue that a lot of women have probably suspected things like this have been going on or experienced specific examples. But actually what's really shocking about this research is the breadth and range of products that are included and the amounts of money. And in some cases, it's possible to avoid it if you just avoid pink. But in some cases, it's about buying a man or a woman's perfume or men and women's jeans. And then it's not so easy to make the switch.
The companies involved, some of them have said, we work hard to offer clear, fair and transparent pricing. That was from Tesco. The number of products for females have additional design and performance features. Another one says that it's about costs based on factors including formulation, ingredients and market comparison. Is that fair enough? Are they spending more on the female versions?
Really, this is just a sexist surcharge. Women are paying extra for the privilege of a product that's apparently designed for them. And the thing that's particularly unfair is that women are being ripped off twice here. So the first time as a result of the pay gap. So in the UK, the average pay gap for a woman working full time is 13.9%. And then when she has earned that money, she finds it doesn't go as far because buying the same things costs her more than it would cost a man. And I just don't buy the idea that these have added modifications. In some cases, there's clearly very little or no difference. But where there are differences, because men and women might have different needs or different preferences, I think it's really revealing that many of these companies are still beginning with the male product as the default and then modifying it or alter it in order to meet women's needs. Women make up over half of the population. So I think really it's time for designers, retailers to start creating products with them in mind. And if modifications really are necessary, making those for both products and splitting the cost fairly.
That was Jemima Olhafsky from the women's rights campaign group, the Fawcett Society. And before we go, a reminder of today's main world news. The US Supreme Court has agreed to consider whether President Obama has the right to protect migrants from deportation after his plans were blocked by legal challenges. Stay with us if you can here on the BBC World Service. David Austin will be here in just a moment with a summary of the latest world news. But for now, from me, Jackie Leonard, and the Newsroom team, thank you for your company.
This is the BBC World Service, where history lives.
The fear.
Whenever I think about it, my flesh crawls and it's just a horrible, horrible thought.
The exhilaration.
I felt excitement, optimism, and yes, there was some tension.
The relief.
She said, "What did you do before the war?" I said, "Well, I used to play the cello." So she said, "Fantastic, you'll be saved."
The people.
He was shabbily dressed, dusty, was in his military fatigue. Could see the sweat lining up his face.
The places.
I can remember a group of Australian women turned up with quick-drying cement and managed to bung up all the base's sewage outlets.
Moments in history brought to life.
We were very surprised when we opened the Sunday newspaper. There was our huge photo on the front page saying our first mixed-race couple.
To listen or view the full Witness collections, go to bbcworldservice.com/witness.
Coming up in The Truth About Diabetes, with me, Katie Watson. I travel to the Kingdom of Tonga, a Pacific island paradise that's experiencing one of the world's worst health crises. 90% of people are overweight or obese. Diabetes is killing the people and costing the poor island nation dear. But what can be done to improve the future of one of the most obese nations on the planet? That's coming up in The Truth About Diabetes, with me, Katie Watson.
BBC News with David Austin. There's growing pressure on European politicians to resolve the migration crisis. Arrivals in Greece from Turkey so far this month are more than 20 times higher than last year. The aid agency MSF has warned that the measures taken so far have had catastrophic results. The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has warned that the EU has no more than 2 months to get the crisis under control. The Supreme Court in the United States has agreed to review President Barack Obama's initiative in allowing some 5 million illegal migrants to remain in the country and work without fear of deportation. The president took the unilateral executive action in 2014 to bypass Congress. It was then blocked by the lower courts. The United Nations says it's catalogued staggering levels of violence against Iraqi civilians over the past 2 years. It's reported more than 18,000 deaths, including acts that may amount to genocide. Some news just in. The Colombian government and the country's largest rebel group, the FARC, have asked the United Nations to oversee the implementation of any ceasefire that the two parties agree to end more than 40 years of conflict. Police in Tunisia are reported to have fired tear gas to disperse hundreds of angry protesters demanding jobs in the central city of Kasserine. The demonstration came 2 days after an unemployed man in the area took his own life. An overnight curfew is now in force in the city. 2 prominent jailed Turkish journalists say their arrest was meant as a warning to the rest of the nation's media. The Cumhuriyet newspaper's editor-in-chief, Can Dündar, and a colleague, Erdem Gül, face